Good morning, hope you slept well. So we have a whole morning to talk and to explore assessment. There's a lot to say about assessment, so I had to kind of like focus it, and my focus especially will be having you look at rubrics from many different angles and different ways of assessing language performances. So I'll talk a little bit first about setting the scene. And with setting the scene, I'll just briefly where I'm coming from. So I've been working like 25 years in Belgium, especially with second language learners in K-12 education, also with foreign language learners there, and in teacher education. And then also I kind of like was in charge of the big international test of Dutch as a foreign language. So this is a standardized proficiency test that is administered all over the world in Dutch, which is basically the main language in the Netherlands and in Flanders, which is a part of Belgium, which kind of like helped me to get to know a little bit about assessment. So setting the scene, and just briefly, because I think this is very familiar with all of you, but just kind of getting on the same page, talk a little bit about our language proficiency, language development, can-do statements, reverse and backwards design, tasks and needs analysis, and PPP. Who knows what PPP is? No. Good one. And this is one, but no. Okay, I'm very curious about that. But just to kick off, what is language proficiency? Just take 1 minute, 2 minutes to talk to your neighbor and just kind of define what you think or what language proficiency is for you. Just turn to one of your neighbors and just like... Okay. What is language proficiency? What are the keywords? How would you define it? Anybody wants to share?
Just very briefly, the ability to function in a language.
To function in a language. Great. Anybody wants to add to that? No?
Kinds of functions: speaking, reading, writing, culture.
Yep.
Anything that you can do with the language.
Anything that you can do with the language. Okay. Yes. So it's basically, very briefly, what a person can do with the language. It's looking at language, how it is being used, how it functions. But it's not, and in opposition we often say it's not what he or she knows about language. And of course what language proficiency is often really explicitly articulated in what we all know can-do statement, is what can you do with the language? What particular functions can you use? So I can participate in spontaneous, spoken, written, or signed conversations on familiar topics, creating sentences and series of sentences to ask and answer a variety of questions. This is one of the intermediate benchmarks in the actual guidelines and can-dos. So one of my colleagues used this kind of picture and I really liked it. So you might have a lot of knowledge. It's often when we talk about language, like, okay, learning how to drive is a very similar way. So you might know how you can parallel park, but if you know it in theory, it doesn't mean that you can put it into practice. That's kind of like a different mode. And there is a connection in between these modes, and we can talk a little bit about that. But basically, if you know how to do something, it's not a guarantee that you actually can do it. And we all know this, and Julie talked a little bit about that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, so we have the actual guidelines, which are basically here in the United States, the guidelines for language learning, for foreign language learning. You have the different levels, from novice to intermediate, to advanced, to superior, and even distinguished. And again, the definition in the actual guidelines is very clear. Language proficiency refers to a person's ability to use a language for a variety of purposes. So including speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And these actual guidelines, and Julie has pointed that all out already, they are very valuable if we want to measure, or if we want to kind of gauge a person's language proficiency, where he or she is at what particular level. And this is called the inverted pyramid. And what's so funny or typical or specific about it, if you look at it? So you have all these levels, but they also have a kind of meaning, how the shape of the pyramid is telling us something about language learning.
I mean, it takes much longer to get from intermediate, let's say, to advanced level than to get from novice to...
Yes. So it tells us something about how much time it takes, also a little bit about what you need to learn, how much you need to learn. So that's not that much at the novice low, but at the intermediate mid, the pyramid widens, so there's much more to learn. The depth, the breadth of language kind of exponentially grows. So to master all what you need to know and to do at the intermediate mid-level takes up much more time. And so that's also often why people get stuck in the intermediate mid-level. It's very difficult to advance to the advanced level. And so this is, and you have that in the PowerPoint, and again the PowerPoint will be made available. This is, I think, always a very nice overview of what these actual levels actually represent. And Julie talked about the parrot level and the linguistic survivor and the kind of like the reporter. And the main important thing is the word level, the sentence level, the paragraph level, moving from very close topics related to the self, to the immediate surroundings, to what you're familiar with, which is personal, to the more impersonal, up to the basically very abstract level, and also from the formulaic, be able to create language, to narrate and describe across time frames, and so on. These are kind of like the key words to identify what level a specific language user is. And I don't know whether you know this graph. This basically also illustrates what we were talking about. It takes a lot of time to get to a particular level. So this is a representation again in one of the publications by Actful, saying like if you start at grade 9 and 10, if you learn the language for like 2 years, you get up to the novice range. And you need probably 4 years or more to basically move into the intermediate range and to kind of like moving in the advanced range. Here they say it's basically starting at kindergarten up through the whole educational system into the college to basically become almost superior. And this is another kind of like, I like this graphic or cartoon representation, how it not only takes time, it also takes a lot of effort. And once you think you're there, there's still so much to learn and still so much to conquer. It might be sometimes a little bit disencouraging, but I think, yeah, so you need to keep the motivation going to learn, and to learn to speak in this case, or to learn what you need to do with a language. But it doesn't only take time and effort, there's also something very unpredictable about it. And so a lot of the research going on now in language acquisition is from a kind of like more dynamic complex system theory, where it's kind of like saying how language develops, how it grows, is kind of very unpredictable. And one of my colleagues did a nice research on writing. And this is writing, and this is writing in grade 3 and 4. So over the course of 2 years, these students, 10, 11 years, and we find the same patterns with adults, They learn how to write, and they learn how to narrate a certain picture story. And the picture story was being evaluated and assessed on one factor. In this case, she did many ones, but we saw everywhere the same pattern on communicative effectiveness. If you have these 6 pictures and you write about them, and you then take the pictures away, so can somebody who is then reading the story understand the story without the picture? So how communicative effective is the message being transmitted? And you would expect that once you know that, you can do that every time. And that's not the case. So nicely, when we average everybody's performance out, we see what we typically expect from language learning. A kind of a curve that's going up, a linear line. So like climbing a ladder, we become better and better every time we do something. If you look at the individual results, you see they're all over the place. It's kind of like, my colleague called this a kind of a plate of spaghetti. It's very difficult to basically see. So sometimes one student got it right, and then she got it wrong again, and then she got it right again. And this is very typical for how language develops in action. It's sometimes unpredictable. Sometimes we're able to do something, and then the next time, you did that in the last class, previous class, you were able to do that. Why aren't you able to do that now anymore? Well, yeah, there are so many things to focus on. So probably one of the students that dropped down in communicative effectiveness was trying something else. It might be creating more complex sentences, or was focusing more on accuracy, and because of this focus on accuracy, she or he kind of forgot to think about the whole message. Is it communicative effective? That's how language learning works. And it's not only how language acquisition works, but it's also how language learning works. And I'm borrowing this from one of my former colleagues as well. So it's not as effective, or like a game of soccer. It's not like, okay, you shoot the ball and it just hits the goal. It's a little bit more unpredictable. So there are so many ways to achieve your goal. But it's not often, or most often, it's not in one nice straight line. So it's not what we teach in the classroom or what the students are learning in the flipped classroom that they immediately have acquired that and have made one next step in their language development. And that's always good to keep that in the back of your mind when thinking about assessment, because also assessment, it's kind of a snapshot of what students are able to do on that particular day with that particular task. And we always hope that we might generalize that to whatever kind of context, but that's especially a tricky one. So if it's like, it takes time, it takes effort, it's a little bit unpredictable, but we definitely need some kind of direction. And the direction is, I think, pretty clear. There's no discussion about that. There are those particular can-do statements. We have them at a little bit of a higher level proficiency benchmark. They have been broken down in performance indicators with respect to the particular sub-levels. And then you also have a lot of examples. Examples that often then also, for example, can be used for self-assessing. How well can a student already do a particular task, something with the language? So can he already participate in a conversation to support or reject a proposed school policy or whatever? Is it, can be identified as a goal? Can you do it without or with certain amounts of help? And Julie also showed some nice examples of that in her PowerPoint, so you can refer back to these. Okay, and just briefly what it's not a checklist of tasks that you can just say, okay, I'm going to take all these examples and I'm going to build a curriculum around that. It's not a prescribed curriculum. It's more like what you want to find out is whether some of these performance indicators, so the higher level examples, whether your students are able to demonstrate a consistent performance over time. It is a set of sample learning tasks that you adapt to your learning goals and to the needs of your students. And so it is a nice starting point for self-assessment, for goal setting, and also the creation of rubrics for performance rating. And this brings us, and I think it was mentioned already yesterday, to backwards design or reverse design. It's basically thinking about what do your students need to be able to do, will be able to do at the end of your program, at the end of your course. Think about how we then build the assessments that kind of gauge whether your students are able to do that. And from these assessments and these goals, start thinking about the activities. And I don't know about you, but many teachers that I know, and also myself, I always we want to jump in and think about nice activities, how we can motivate our students and be able to do this. So it's taking one step back and rethinking a little bit what you're doing. And so my background is a little bit more also in task-based language learning, task-based language teaching. And what is kind of like, if you're doing that, and I think also thinking from a reverse design perspective, is also that you need to think about what do my students need in terms of language. And so then we often, what we find is then what people are doing is performing a needs analysis. And this, for example, is very, just a kind of like, could be a needs analysis with respect to international students that arrive here at Michigan State University. What do they need to do with language when they enter this college? And so there are a number of tasks here that kind of like require language. So it's not thinking about what language do they need, but in what kind of situations do they need to function with that particular language, and can we describe these, and can we use these to set our goals and to think about our assessments and to think about the activities that we want to practice in our classroom. And so this is one of course, this is less applicable to a foreign language context. So this is typically for their functioning in English, in an English medium society. So when we were kind of like developing our assessments for Dutch as a foreign language, we also kind of like tried to gauge why are all these students worldwide, that could be in Hungary, that could be in Indonesia, that could be in the States here, why are they learning Dutch? Why is Dutch of so much interest to them? Why do they want to use it? And there are a multitude of reasons. And so we try to gauge that multitude of reasons and try to link that to the particular assessments, the standardized assessments. And one of the profiles that we found out was that a lot of the students, they're interested in the language and they want to learn to use Dutch for certain tourist purposes. They were very interested in the Netherlands, for example, to go into the Netherlands. And let me tell you, I'm not sure whether that kind of like is also true for your languages. A lot of the reasons that students wanted to learn Dutch was because of love. They were really interested in either they had a Dutch friend or girlfriend or boyfriend, or they wanted to get one. So apparently Dutch boyfriends and girlfriends are very high up the rank of desirable. So, but basically we identified them for tourist purposes and informal context. So this was the lowest level. This was basically the A2 level of the Common European Framework. And so we identified certain context situations to operationalize that kind of need, that kind of desire. And this kind of guided the tasks that we developed in that particular assessment. So for example, selecting information and instruction in public announcements, instructions and weather forecasts. So be able to understand a broadcast in a railway station. Or asking if, this was a very important one, personal information, describing a personal experience, expressing feelings during a conversation with a Dutch speaker. So talking about oneself, talking about one's own country, which is often, you know, this is always the questions that you get. How is that in your country? So how is it in your culture? So what do you do? And how being able to respond to these kind of questions. And for example, also to understand and fill out an official form asking for personal information. So this is one way of going about that, and I think what Julie pointed out as well is it's worthwhile of having a conversation with your students about what kind of goals do they think are important? What are the goals that they have identified for studying a particular language? And can you incorporate them in your classroom? And so that's basically links again with this reverse design. Backwards design is what you want your students to be able to do. And when we go a little bit deeper in that literature on reverse design, I think an interesting thing is it's not just about the language goals. It's also, and we could talk about the 5 C's, or nowadays it's more and more linked to the 21st century competencies. It's identifying kind of like, and that's some of the work that has been done in Carla, is identifying a big idea. It's not just about having all these language targets, these can-do statements. It's trying to bring them together and identifying a big idea, an engaging theme, and essential questions that challenges students to look for answers. And so and you can click on that link and to see some more of these, for example, engaging questions. So it's basically a little bit of project work that is being kind of like advocated here. Like, what is the meaning of life? Which is, of course, a very big question. It's not the one that you want to tackle in the first class. Why can't all children go to school? How does art reflect time and space? Again, a very abstract one. How much free time or vacation does a person need? And that might differ widely across cultures. So, but the big thing is, like, and they give a kind of counter example, it's not talking about clothes. If you talk about clothes, it's just about you know what you're focusing on the vocabulary. You're focusing on identifying how do we call this and how do we call that, but that's so not focusing on types of houses, on clothes or whatever. It's not about lists of vocabulary. It's being able to put that vocabulary to use in a more significant context, a more pertinent context. And so that brings us also to the fact that we build then a curriculum or a syllabus based on what people or what students need to do to find the answer to these big questions. So in what kind of context, what kind of tasks do they need to be able to perform, rather than building a curriculum on the language knowledge or the grammar or the vocabulary. That still might, we're not throwing this out, but we're just saying this is not basically the principle that organizes your curriculum. And briefly, tasks, then we consider, what do we consider a task? Is definitely an activity where meaning is primary. So the communicative context is central, and there is a kind of communicative problem to solve. There's a linguistic challenge. We talked about that gap. Rajiv asked the interesting question about I+1. For example, the whole idea might be that if you have a task, if you have a lot of input, a lot of language to process, that might more target the different I+1s of your different students than if you're focusing on only one particular grammatical rule, for example. So more people can process more of the language that they are encountering. But there's also kind of like a relationship with real-world activities. There's a purpose. Why do students basically engage in this task? It's clear why they are doing this task, what they are learning. And then, of course, this links that you have to assess your tasks in that way as well. And so in this case, the proficiency kind of clashes a little bit with the traditional model. And this is where the PPP points out. It's not a PowerPoint. It is often referred to in literature as the presentation, practice, production approach. And it's a very deeply ingrained approach in language teaching. And it's because we all learned the language that way. We were all being taught the language that way. That's what we basically know the best, that we're also very good at. And it is often it starts then with the presentation of grammar and vocabulary. What often is called the focus on form. And then often there are kind of like drills and error corrections. It's the controlled practice, where now you looked at this particular rule, now you're going to practice this rule in a very controlled environment. And then we move to the free production. And I'm not sure how it is in your classroom, but with many teachers that I observed, they all find this very important, but it's often they lack the time of doing that, because this already takes up so much time. So that's where the flipped classroom then comes in and freeing up some of the time, so that at least the time that we have in the classroom should be focusing on particularly this aspect. And then we have, of course, form-focused assessment. So this is more the idea that knowledge about language precedes the use. And we don't discard knowledge at all. We say it might be helpful, but it's not sufficient. It's perhaps not the most efficient way of learning a language. Or it's not enough, because that we know already. Okay, quickly. Yeah, Rajiv, do you have it?
Do we have time for questions? Like,
yeah, sure.
So please, there's so many. You are an assessment guru. I want to use this time to learn a little bit about my idea which are not clear. So, 21st century competence, that backward design and assessment is all about, people try to do the competence, communicative competence, if I say. And you know more than me on this line of thought. I always believe that it's all about performance. Like if you're not performing, is that a loosely used terminology for communicative competence? Or because how you're tapping the competence if you're asking what you...
Well, the thing is that competences has different meanings, the concept competence. So the traditional, what we know in language, competence performance model goes back to Chomsky. And then the competence is something very abstract that we basically, and it's abstract knowledge. In Chomsky's terminology, it is knowledge about language. It's what he calls grammar. It's not the pedagogical grammar, but it's the grammar that we have in our minds. And performance is what we actually see. When we talk about competence more in an educational setting, when we talk about 21st century competencies are a very complex concept that are, if you kind of like dissect them, they are about knowledge, they are about performance, and they are about attitudes. So competence in 21st century competence or in education often means like it's an integrated, you know something, you have a certain attitude toward that, and you know how to put that in use.
Okay.
That's a little bit of a difference.
In that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. My second question is about, like, we are always talking about what you can do, and like the tapping. But this gives me I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that what you can do versus, like, I can speak in English, and I'm trying to speak in English, but I'm not proficient one. And the idea of performance, and you can do this without having grammar knowledge or like nitty-gritty of it, it leads to the fossilization.
It's sorry?
It leads to the fossilization. I'm fossilized. I never use the correct English in a subjunctive or, or like, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think that we should not see that these two, the idea of proficiency as opposed to the idea of grammar. I mean, actually, when we base our activities on assessment or on following the actual guidelines, and we aim our students to be superior, we aim our students to be able to do abstract tasks, to go into the abstract world, and they won't be understood unless they have a complete control of the grammar, or a complete or good control of the grammar. Otherwise, we won't follow their abstract discourse or what they are saying. I mean, I think that well, it's not the fact that we are teaching or not teaching grammar, but where the focus is. If we are teaching grammar just for fun or per se, or we are focusing on students being able to narrate something or to describe something, and we teach the grammar that they need in order to do so. For instance, in Spanish, it makes no sense to teach subjunctive when they are in second year or in Catalan, because we do not want them to hypothesize things. So just
no free thinking.
Because not free thinking, but hypothesis is something that comes with the just
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we want them to narrate, so we have to stick to okay.
I,
We are able to.
yeah, I agree. And again, that also relates again to the idea perhaps we should speak about language competencies, but that's so, the term is difficult in language because Chomsky has defined that, whereas it's defined completely differently outside of language, in the sense that competences, they are also, it is about knowledge also. It is putting that knowledge to a certain extent to use. But it is also, and I think I agree completely, it's with the focus of grammar. Like also in task-based language teaching, there are opportunities what we call focus on form, but it's not at the center of the activity of what we're doing. It's, you are learning a lot of grammar implicitly already by doing the tasks, but if we want to prevent fossilization, if we feel time and time again that you kind of like make these kind of mistakes, that you're not being able to get to the next point, there's nothing wrong. And again, it sometimes relates with the type of learners that you have, to just pause, to press the pause button, and to reflect on that language, and to formulate a rule. Have them discover the rule for themselves, inductively or deductively, give the rule, and give them some controlled practice. But it's mostly about, like, as Julie also said, and I believe the people in our Spanish program also, we have been teaching the subjunctive for so year after year, spending so much time on this, whereas the actual use of the subjunctive in actual language use, there's a mismatch, a complete mismatch there. So why are we putting so much time and effort in mastering that subjunctive, whereas you might only need to master part of that?
Yeah, yeah. Just a little bit of a kind of anecdote here. Not knowing the rule of the language, I don't think that's the cause of fossilization.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like for example, I know very well the distinction between he and she, but I still.
Yeah.
Because you're comfortable, you could be understood, and that's why you don't care.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
exactly my point. Because a
Yeah.
student performs, and first of all, I think it should be communicative performance rather than communicative competence. We should change the term somehow. But if you know, if I can perform in English, there's a classic example in SLS studies about the Japanese musician who say, like, this is not my problem if you don't understand my English, it's your problem.
Yeah.
Because then because he communicates well, he is very successful in the meditation.
Yeah.
You learn my English, I don't learn your English.
Yeah.
So,
But-
because
yeah.
and you know, like this idea that okay, focus is this and grammar is not the focus, or we cannot speak language without grammar. I completely understand.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to say, when the focus is too much in our classroom teaching on task-based instruction, can you do this? If you just focus on that,
Yeah.
you know, they cannot do anything else unless you give them building blocks to
Mhm.
perform.
Yeah.
So it's not like I'm completely against what you're saying. I'm just expressing
No.
my concern.
And I don't want to take this too much, and we can talk
Yeah.
about it. But just like also in my viewpoint is also, it depends
Yeah.
on, like, we're all working with highly educated language learners, or we should be, and they are used to, they understand the meta language, or they should be able to understand the meta language. And if you're able to do that, you can use grammar to your advantage. But like in Belgium, we've been working with a lot of lowly educated second language learners. It makes no sense teaching about grammar. They don't even know what a noun is, what a verb is. So how can you then, they learn the language without the grammar. They might fossilize, they might not fossilize. Again, that's also dependent on the cues that you get from the people you're speaking to, whether they sometimes just implicitly correct you or not. So there are many things that impact fossilization. But so it depends also on who are you teaching. What are they expecting? Can they use this code information, this grammar information to their benefit or not? A lot of students cannot. Some of them can. And again, even if they are aware, they can reflect on language, they are metalinguistically aware and can use that language, it's also sometimes the type of learner that you are. When you're speaking, do you feel that do you have your monitor on? Are you always monitoring what you're saying and saying, oh no, I'm saying this wrong, damn. And I try not to do so the next time. Or this monitor is always out because it's not the way that you use language and that you work. So there's also something like, I feel like a lot of people, you might have this, what Krashen would call the monitor always on, and you're reflecting and you're monitoring your own language use, and you're thinking, damn, that's not what I wanted to say, that's not my intention, I got it wrong, or my message did not basically, wasn't able to bring this across. So that's also something very, I think, personality kind of like how that works or not. Yes?
I think when we are talking about proficiency, we should divide different languages. It's actually like Julie said us yesterday, that we should see the needs of the students and ask them about their
Yes.
needs. It's for the languages also, when we are talking about proficiency, it's not only about the communication. For example, for Persian, when you are talking about communication, it means that you want to go, maybe some of the learners want to go to Japan or want to go to Israel or everywhere to talk to the ordinary people there, or reserve a hotel room, or reserve a taxi, but it is not about Iran. You cannot go to Iran. There is no possibility for talk to ordinary people there. And most of the students, they wanted to, for example, read the newspapers, Iranian newspapers, or they have two main goals for the political goals or historical, philosophical goals. It means that they want to learn about the history of Iranian or Islam philosophy, Islamic philosophy, or the history of Islam, and they need grammar.
I agree.
Most important here.
Again,
and I'm sorry to add just a
Yes.
minute. The PPP that came out from the skill acquisition, you guys, I think for script for languages like Hindi or Urdu or Persian and stuff, that does work for us, because practice is required, and if we are not, and we are talking much about competence and like interpretation of looking at the data in a language, but like the cognitive load that the Cognate language and the Romanized Roman script languages altogether, the cognitive load is much higher on little and for different scripts, because they're not interpreting, they're just putting their first-hand effort in just read that word. So I totally agree, but I also see a little bit.
I'll make two caveats, but then I'll want to move along. I'm not saying that this does work. So this is skill acquisition-based model, but it only works if you have more than enough time based on this third P. And this is where sometimes precisely the hurdle is, because we aren't able to create enough time for this third P. This is what we see time and time again. So often, like also when you look at a textbook, the most interesting activities are at the back of a unit. And then we don't have time to do those. And we have to move to the next unit. But then the most interesting activities are always at the back. So because this is based on this model, because you present something, you practice something, and then you use it. So often when we say, it's just turn it around. Start with the last activity. And then try to integrate the other aspects. That's one thing. The second thing is, we don't even have the time to present all of the grammar. We always look at a little particular segment of the grammar, and that's also what you pointed out. There are so many elements in the language which we basically don't have rules for, not in pedagogic grammar at least. There are all these things that we know as a native speaker and that non-native speakers always struggle with. It might be like, for example, in Dutch, gender. No one knows about how, because you can formulate some rules, but they're so complex. Or the articles, whether it's a defined or an indefined article. Indefinite and definite article, sorry. We don't know. Every second language speaker is getting it wrong. It's all based on input flood there, and trying to figure it out. Because there are little rules in the pedagogical grammar that you actually can use. So that's also one of the kind of like caveats and the limitations of the PPP model. Okay, but let's move on. I was going to ask you, very briefly now, to think about it, just to talk a little bit about what are the goals of your language class, because we already talked about it, but just take like 1-2 minutes again with your neighbor or in pairs to talk about that.
So I started. So if we know that we have to go the expectations.
Juliet 100 points. Why were you laughing?
We're laughing
It's good. I like it. Can't control myself, sorry. Okay. I'll just briefly share with you, I like this. Some of my colleagues here in the language programs, they came up with this list, and I might have added someone, is like some of the goals. So you might want to focus on a certain vocabulary. Certain tasks might be the focus. We might just have, I want to get them to that particular level. There are the goals. So, which one would you identify with? Or are there other ones? So this one is the most. This one is the most popular one, and people can recognize. Yes, I think so too. Okay. We set the scene for about a long time, but never mind. Oh yes, and just like basically as a kind of final slide with this section is that if people engage in this backwards design, they feel that it's very beneficial because it helps them to get a good grip on what are we doing exactly, where are we heading at, and how are we kind of going that way, and how are we realizing our goals. And again, it links up often with the real world. Why do we need the language for? And again, we talked a little bit about it. There are different reasons there. Okay, let's move to assessment level. These are two terms that you often will find in the literature: performance-based language assessment or proficiency-based language assessment. Okay, what is performance or proficiency-based language assessment? I'll just tell you from the start that for me there is no difference. I think they're used in different contexts depending on what kind of hat people are wearing and they're talking about.
Or where you are speaking. Or where you are speaking.
Or where you are speaking, yes. I think the ACTFL consistently talks about performance-based assessment. In the language testing world, a lot of talk is about proficiency-based assessment. So about the fact that you are proficient in a language, which means that you can perform the language. Okay, let's then, so performance-based assessment, I think, kind of like what this picture says it all. We come back to driving our car. So we have different ways of assessing that. We have, okay, you have to learn the highway codes, and you're being assessed on your knowledge of the highway codes. This might be also, what's to my, it was really interesting for me to take the driver's test here, because like, especially the knowledge, the highway code, this is all pen and paper. And this is almost without any visualization. The context is completely linguistic. It's telling you, okay, a car is coming from that way, you're heading up from that way, blah, 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 what's happening? Like I was used to, like in Belgium, you just get a picture of the situation. And they ask you whether you can drive on or need to stop or whatever. So this was completely a context created in language, which is also very interesting. So with your test, you're being tested on the highway code, but then finally, even if you pass the highway code with a high score, that does not mean that you're able to drive. So, and in the drivers, and again, so speaking to the knowledge and the whole performance, at least when we're testing somebody's driving skill, we test both the knowledge, but we also definitely test the performance. And it's always still good to keep in mind that this is a kind of simulation. So we are trying to gauge, but it is a simulation. It's not the real life practice. If somebody is able to do something in your classroom on a test, on an assessment, it is a kind of a simulated behavior. Hopefully we hope that that person can go out into the real world and do that as well. But we are never sure about that, because that's, again, a little bit of a different context. And this interest in performance or proficiency-based is basically goes back a long time, because we always feel this is kind of like common sense, isn't it? If we want to find out how well a person can perform a task, we just want to see whether he or she can do that task, can perform that task. And then we can think about the quality and the quantity of the product. And that's why I like also task-based language assessment. I included here the definition of task-based language assessment, because it also tries to define that context. It's not just language use, but it's also you're expressing and interpreting a certain meaning within a well-defined communicative context. You have an audience, you have a purpose. Think about that. Try to create an assessment that basically makes that very clear. What are you expected to do with language in what particular context? For whom? For what purpose? Think about that. Towards a valued goal or outcome. And within task-based proficiency, we feel that it is important, as John Norris pointed out, because we want to focus on what they can do with the language. And it is what they can do, again, it's integrated. It's language and form that gets assessed. And we want to have an assessment that provides useful feedback. We'll talk a little bit about that. And this feedback then creates a certain washback in what do we really want to do? What is important? It makes it real. We want to counter some negative influence of traditional knowledge assessment and then align testing with new involving language pedagogies. Okay. Now let's get to what really matters. How do we then elicit and rate language performances? So I'm going to talk a little bit about speaking and about writing. I chose this focus. And we're looking at several speaking assessments, just briefly introducing the oral proficiency interview, and then looking at some other contexts and writing a few contexts, and we'll talk a little bit about the integrated performance assessments. These are actful ones that are especially being used in the K-12 setting. So assessing speaking. Okay. I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with the oral proficiency interview. This is, of course, the hallmark of assessment. This is what the most important assessment is here in the US and within ACTFL. And it's a very standardized way of assessing the proficiency level and sub-level that the particular speaker is at. And it can take up to well, 30 minutes up to an hour to basically assess that speaker's proficiency, engage it. And it follows a typical pattern of a warm-up, basically putting the candidate at ease, then kind of like having a mutual introduction, introducing the test format, and then the interview continues, and it's a continuous cycle of checking whether somebody is at a particular level versus whether he or she can already function at a higher level. You remember what Julie said, like the intermediate high, for example, and the advanced low, how that's being distinguished is you already, if you are at the intermediate high level, you can already perform most of the time, sometimes even, and there's some discussion, is it 50% up to even 70% of the time at the advanced level, but you are the fallen angel, you fall down, you can't sustain that performance always at that particular level in a very large variety of contexts, purposes, and so on. And once the interviewer is kind of confident that she or he has gauged the level, then there is a wind down and again put the candidate at ease and let him or her go. But it's a very strict format. And you can use some ideas of that in your own classroom to kind of like gauge the oral proficiency of a student. But as you know, these interviewers, they go to a very rigorous training. It takes a lot of time to be able to gauge that particular language proficiency level in a reliable way. And again, what the interviewers and then the second raters, because it's also rated by a second rater, do is kind of link that performance to these levels and the particular sub-levels. This is a very nice format, but it's very standardized. It's not easy to use, and it definitely, I think, as an instructor, you'll be able to gauge in general the level of the student. I think there's no problem there. It becomes more tricky in identifying the sub-levels probably. There are always so many other ways. And I'll just like introduce you to some other ones. This is, for example, the MSU Speaking Test. So this is a test that's being used here to again gauge speaking, and basically to gauge the level of English of teaching assistants. It's kind of a yes or no. Is this person, are we allowing him to become a teacher assistant? Is his level or her level of English well enough so that the students are able to understand what he or she is talking about? Might be about geography, mathematics, might be about language. It's kind of gauging that one. And what they have is they have a lot of questions, 12 questions. And so depending on the question, the test taker has from 30 to 90 seconds to record an answer. So it's again, you record the performance, and these are the example questions. It's one of your favorite movies, it's playing in a local theater. Tell me about the movie and why you like it. Very straightforward. And some students attend large universities, others prefer smaller schools. What do you think are the advantages of each type of evaluation? Of education, sorry. And many people enjoy visiting zoos and seeing the animals. Other people believe that animals should not be taken from their natural surroundings and put into zoos. I'd like to know what you think about this issue. So you see what's being gauged here? Most of them are expressing, okay, you are standing in front of a classroom, you're able to talk about the pros and the cons, to kind of like formulate an argument, to identify what are the advantages, disadvantages, and so on. And this is an easy way of doing that, in a certain way. But you have a lot of responses there. So how do you think they are going to evaluate these? What would the criteria be? What criteria would they use? How would you evaluate this? Sorry?
The question is saying, for instance, one of your favorite movies explain something about the movie and how you like it. So here you are asking for information and then justification. So you are, I guess that you are assessing whether you can understand and follow the information without
Okay.
having an idea of the movie without having to
Yeah.
know of the movie.
Yeah.
And in the second, you are asking for more complex tasks, which is comparisons, because they will not establish a set of advantages and disadvantages, so
Yeah.
effectiveness, communicating effectiveness on the one hand, and if you are able to fall with being without having a sympathetic ear.
Okay, cool. Yeah, nice. I like your set of criteria. Anybody wants to add something to that? Yes?
I will check with the cohesion. That idea is coherence about the flow, and then something about, I wouldn't call it pronunciation, but an aspect related to accent.
To accent, okay. Whether they're...
I would take that back, not accent. I'm looking for a word.
Intelligibility? Comprehensibility?
Thank you very
Yes.
much. God bless you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah. So I think what the test takers, the testers that administer this test, what they're kind of struggling with is you have so many prompts, short prompts. So are you identifying then criteria related to each individual prompt, or are you trying to kind of come up with some more, in this case, criteria that kind of covers them all? And I think because they have to rate so many small performances and probably have so many test takers, they came up with some more general, but keep those criteria that you have in mind, because we're going to talk about that. So basically, on the one hand, they wanted to see whether these potential teaching assistants are able to answer these questions spontaneously. Because like if a student asks a question in the classroom, you want to basically respond to that. And then they were looking at their ability to elaborate, to see whether they can basically talk about something, make it very clear, and add detail to that. Because again, as a teacher, you probably need to do that. And then there is the clarity and comprehensibility, which is very important because you might be able to respond and you might say a lot of interesting things, but people must be able to understand what you're saying. Otherwise, you're kind of like, yeah. So, raters are evaluating the comprehensibility of the spoken English and the ability to elaborate in original, spontaneous answers to questions. But this is very general. And so on the one hand, these speaking prompts are interesting, and as you pointed already out, each prompt kind of like leads to different criteria if you really think about it in detail. So I'm moving now to a completely different level and another type of speaking prompt. And this is another kind of type of speaking prompt that is being used here, but for a completely different purpose. So if international students arrive, they are giving the MSwell, the test, that gauges their language level. And based on that, they either get to follow at the English Language Center some English language courses or not. But they always struggle with this test, which is a very standard test. If you go and look at IELTS, TOEFL, whatever, a standardized assessment, the MSwell is very much like that. But they felt like at the lower level, we have a group of students, and the MSwell is not really differentiating there. So you're talking now about the novice, intermediate, low level. So the MSwell, they kind of like differentiates between the intermediate and the intermediate, mid, high, and advanced, low, and so on. But this low level students speaking, how do we differentiate with that? And I want to do a little exercise with you there. So we're going to look at this prompt, and they came up with a low level placement test. And it's a kind of like they interview two students at the same time, but they're not actually interacting. Basically, they are evaluating their presentational capacities, they evaluate the ability to use a turn. So it's presentational, basically, talk a little bit about the prompt. So it's a picture storyboard to elicit performance, which also works if they have no reading ability in the target language, which might sometimes be the case. And they use the rubric to score the performance. And so you're going to use that rubric. So I have a kind of extensive handout, sorry for all the paper. But it contains a lot of rubrics that we're going just to have a look at. So on the first page you will find the picture story, so that you can keep that in mind. And on the second page you find the rubric. And the whole speaking test is basically a little bit the same as the oral proficiency. You have a warm-up, you have some warm-up question, you have then a picture narration task, and you might have some follow-up questions. So there are 2 test takers, and there are 2 examiners as well. One takes the lead, the other one is kind of doing the rating at the time also. So they rate independently first, then they negotiate the final score. And the rubric basically, and this is what makes it interesting, is also empirically derived from observations of what these low-level speakers are able to do and to create a rubric from that. So the prompts, and as you will see, so the criteria are syntax, vocabulary, fluency, communication strategies, and listening and interaction. And what this test should be able to do is identify students into 2 groups. One group of students that they feel is ready to go to a level 1 course. And the other ones that they say they're not there yet. They need a kind of like an introductory course, a kind of like a stepping stone course before they can move into the regular program. And we'll listen to some examples to see and to identify the minus level 1 and the level 1. And then I'll have you rate 2 examples for yourself and use the rubric and talk to one of your neighbors about that. So I'm not going to go into much detail here, but it's basically, the first one is they can hardly produce any language. It's just like single words. If they can already produce some language, they often are in the level 2. There's some short phrases, some combinations. It's definitely very much at the novice level. And the vocabulary is very limited. And whereas if you are in level 1, you at least can produce some sentences, some basic syntax, some simple connectors, and also the vocabulary is already kind of like sufficient. You show some evidence of low frequency words and so on. And the fluency is you are already kind of fluent versus the other ones have really lengthy pauses. And the use of strategies and so on. Let's, so you can have a look at that. Let's listen first to 2 examples. And they have been transcribed here so that you can follow them. Let's check.
I think old man take menu cereal. I think take cornflakes. Cornflakes and milk. Same cornflakes. He's think he's think food. And spoon.
Okay, so have a look already at the rubric and kind of like formulate an idea where this person is at. You want to listen to it once more, or it's okay? Okay.
So is this a student at university or?
This is an international student that has applied to this university, yes. So, and he did not do well, as you can imagine, on the MSU, the big tests. And so now they're trying to gauge what other level, where they should start him at. Okay. And then let's listen to another student.
There is someone who wake up early. He want to eat breakfast. He eats some cereal. He put the cereal in the bowl. Then the cereal go out the bowl. Then he pick up the cereal and put it in the cereal box. Then he put some sugar and milk. He eats slowly, maybe. He think it's very salt, not without sugar. He want to put some sugar. Then he eats.
Okay, so you definitely see these are two different levels. Okay, what do you think? The first test taker, what level would you put it? 2? Why?
Well, he has frequent pauses. He lacks vocabulary for many elements in the story, but he still has some vocabulary for some of the elements.
Cool. Yeah. Anybody wants to add to that, or has a different opinion?
I think it's more isolated. I don't know. I would go with 1 because it's
I would 1 too.
Because I mean, there's no simple phrases really.
Yeah, that's approximately 5 words
Yeah.
that he uttered. That
Okay. Any other backing for level 2? Or for level 1? This student was put in level 2.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So basically, and you can discuss about that, so the raters, they go through a kind of training.
What's the level 1 then?
Almost no language, basically. Almost being able to say nothing. So you could kind of like discuss the functionality of that level, but apparently at this very low level, they still feel that they have candidates that just sit and stare and probably say food, spoon, eat, something like that, and they would be categorized at level 1. And here you have already that, at least some like chunks like I think, old man take, menu, that make some sense, that are already, there are no connectors there, it's no real sentence, but the words are put in a kind of position, sequence that creates at least some meaning. And again, and this is at some point thinking about what does this test need to do and how does it help us differentiate. And you can discuss about that, but they feel that they at least had to have a range of 4 to differentiate between their students' level. And so this one. I hear 4. Does anybody want to elaborate? There are connectors.
But there's not much control of complex syntax. There's no.
True.
There's no aspect or tense really.
Well, some control, and it's like there is someone who wakes up early. There's a relative clause there.
And she completes the task. So why
Yes.
bother about grammar?
Yeah. Yeah. So,
and she sticks with the same tense. She's not going between present, past,
Yeah,
future.
there's no
She's not
awareness
switching.
of
She's
tense or
consistent,
aspect.
and
Yeah.
you know that is a description of what she sees.
it's a description of what she sees. She accomplishes the task.
Yeah.
She definitely has some control over the language, over the code. She's able to already create to certain point complex, at that level, sentences. So then the cereal will go out of the bowl, very incomplete and not correct at all. But there is some mastery there. Definitely she is at the sentence level. So she's definitely at the sentence level. She has not much difficulty with vocabulary. She definitely still struggles with some text. She's fluent. She's very fluent.
Able to use adverbs, which is
sorry, and
able to use adverbs, which is generally not,
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think there is someone who wait. So she has some kind of complex grammar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just her tense and aspect is
Yes.
not,
Yes. Yeah.
there.
Yeah. But that's something that you can focus on. And
It completely makes sense though, even if you miss the grammar.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but she's at the scientific level. She's not creating any story. She's connecting, yeah, not only using that, but
Yeah.
But paragraph levels
I
are
think she's at 4.
But paragraph levels.
I think she's
Yes.
at
Yeah.
4.
So again, this is the. Remember, these are 4 levels within the lowest level of language speakers. So these are basically the language speakers and users that you could not place on the basis of the regular tests. And so they're trying to gauge what at least they can do within their minimal language to differentiate there so that they can place them in the best course for them. Yeah. Okay.
So what level?
Oh, sorry. Level 4. Level 4. Okay. And let me now introduce you to 2 other students. And you'll rate both samples using the rating rubric. So you listen to Mohammed and you listen to Dhanawat, and you try to rate them and assign a level to them. Okay. Here we go.
Okay, this is man Hungary. He is like corporate. He is open the Koen, box Koen. He is man. He is yeah.
It's the story of Muhammad. Yeah.
No, this is so
in bullet.
Bowl.
Yeah, in bowl. He is in table. He is crowd in table. Okay. Okay.
He said shut up.
Okay, do you want to hear it once more, or is it okay? Okay. Wants to hear it once more, or sorry, no. Okay, okay, cool. Okay, I have just like 10 seconds to think about this. Okay, everybody has a level in mind. Let's go to the next one.
This one is also about food. Food catch. With a snack. Yeah, a snack. Cereal. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. This is a cereal. He wants his cereal. He opened cereal and he checked in the this or below. Okay. Okay. But and then he push outside in the road and okay. Next, he caused rock cereals and she push in sugar and push in milk, and he eating and okay, he eating finished.
Yeah, and he ate for cereal.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Very good.
Okay, so Mohammed.
That's a 1.
Well, based on
Yep, go.
Yeah.
But
Well, see, based on the first one, which seemed much more limited to me, like, and that was rated a 2. This one, I would say he had a few phrases in there. So
Yeah.
He attempts to make a sentence, but grammatical.
There were a few little ones, but like the
Yeah,
first
the way you helped him, too.
the first one was rated as a level
Yeah.
2, like on the first page, and that was like the I think old man take, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
That guy had.
good point. Yes.
What was that point?
I was just asking, are we rating based
Yes.
on what he can do and not what he cannot do? Because
Yeah.
that's what I'm hearing constantly. He can't
Yeah.
do this, he can't do that, but that's not what we're doing
No,
here.
it's a really good point. Yes, it is already, we know all of these have limited proficiency, limited competence, limited means to making sense and creating meaning, but still what can they do with the limited arsenal of vocabulary, rules, whatever they have? And Emily was right. And again, you can question it, but he was placed at level 2, seeing that he could still make some sense. And I definitely see the conflict between how level 1, I haven't seen a level 1, so I cannot. But I think there are some long pauses, but he tries with an extremely limited vocabulary to create a little bit of meaning.
I think the key here would be the mixture of single words
Yeah.
and simple phrases, because it's very simple.
It's very, 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 and you really have to be a very sympathetic listener to assign meaning here. But then, okay, let's see at Tanawat. So,
2.5.
2.5.
Oh, the other guy?
Yes.
I think he's 3.
Yes. 3? 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's 3. Yeah. And I think, and he's again, so you see the difference with the level 4 here but he was still kind of fluent.
Yes.
And he was less at the sentence level where the other one was. He's more at the clause level, the phrase level. He kind of has well-formed clauses, but they're kind of like not nicely connected. His vocabulary is definitely one level up from Mohammed, but definitely not still very, very limited. But I think it's nice to see, because this is the cutoff point. So, and I was listening to, if you have these two ones in your classroom, I think you can feel the difference. Like if you ask Mohammed a question, how long it will take for him to answer that question. How that will kind of like already impede the pace of what's happening in the class. Whereas Tanawat still struggles a lot, but he can already create language there. And there's more language there, and there's some fluency there. So I would definitely see that rationale why I want to put Tanawat and the other one in a different course than Mohammed and the first one. Yes?
I think, for example, Mohammed, the way I look at it, and I could hear her comment in a sense that we look at what, I mean, you might have paid more attention to the fact that he could not do something because of his helper.
Yes.
That affected my judgment in a way that he struggled
Yeah,
to try
he
to
struggled.
say something. But if the lady was not there helping him, I would pay more attention to the fact of his production.
Yeah.
Was really something he was able to do more than.
Yes.
I mean, it really impacted me that he could not do. That's why he has someone to help him.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the reason behind having a second person there.
It's a reason of practicality so they bring in 2 students. So Mohammed first does the task, and then basically his wife, because it's his wife, does the task after that, and it just creates a little bit of a better flow of the whole exam and the participants. But yes.
But then how's that fair for the first person who goes without any previous input, and the second person is already hearing?
Well, she might. I'm not sure. Sorry, she might get another picture story.
Yeah,
she will probably get another
Okay,
picture
it'll
story.
be the
Yes.
And
Yeah.
because the interviewers are already giving input, they're
Yeah,
giving them
no,
words.
she will get another picture story.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry for that. Yes, I should have. Yeah.
I'm still confused because I think if you are planning for them to have pair work, they are going to interact in a different situation.
Yeah.
Then they should be there. Otherwise, that would be a good prep for the other person.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
I wouldn't
yes.
do that.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not sure, and I should ask a little bit more. I think there's also something about, don't know whether it puts their minds more to ease that there's somebody next to them that they know, whether that comes into play. But I think it's more a practicality issue here of how to, yes. Okay. You had a question or?
I just wanted to say that Tanawat is more strategic as well. He can skip a few things, and he uses very simple sentences to keep the things easy.
Yeah.
As compared to Muhammad, he stretches the thing a lot. So that's kind of learning management or expressing management is lacking.
Yeah, yeah. And they try to take that a little bit into account with the communication strategies and so on.
Yeah.
So they're focusing a lot on the syntax and the vocabulary, although they also, and when we kind of rating them, I always feel like we fall back on these because they're easy to notice. But the good thing is also like they really have a look at all 4 criteria, and they discuss these 4 criteria. Okay, let me just have a quick look. And just going as kind of like a segue into the next activity as well, or just try to finish this up. So let's look at a completely different speaking task. So we had like the questions, we had the speaking prompt, and now we have more of this context, which might perhaps fit better a specific program, language for specific purposes perhaps. But this is a really context of you are a purchasing agent for a wholesale catering business which sells eggs to restaurants, and then you need to do this. So you need to take this into account. You need to have a number of eggs, you have to think about the current price, and you have to think about delivery. And so call 3 suppliers of eggs, negotiate a discount, place your order with the cheapest supplier who can meet your needs. So this is a kind of like, I feel, a completely different task.
Complicated. There's a lot more detail.
A lot more detail, yes.
Numbers, yes.
Sorry?
Numerals are also to be used. So
yeah, yes.
Actually complex.
Yeah. So you see, it's not all about language here. This is a nice example. So, and when we go into language assessment, there's always this constant discussion, and Tim McNamara put it on a continuum of performance. When you're talking about performance-based assessment, proficiency-based assessment, you always are also talking about often something. And when we looked at the previous prompt, so basically the criteria were more language and how you perform, but they were not looking at the content. They are looking at the content through the vocabulary, but not checking off, did he say something about the cereal box, about eating, taking a spoon, whatever. And this is also something that, depending upon what type of course you are teaching, are you teaching a more content-based course, is also about, okay, from a very performance-based perspective, going to the previous task, basically there's only one criteria. Did he or she fulfill the task? Did she get the best deal for the eggs? Delivered on time, the number of eggs is correct, and it's the best price, and it's the best delivery. And so some people would say you don't even need to assess the language. If he or she gets the task done, we're there. Others would say, no, we don't. Task fulfillment is not important. We just look at the language. Or you try to combine both. And I think that's something that you need to think about. So are you identifying criteria also on the content, on what you kind of like expect the students to talk about, how to create what the content of the discourse is, versus only the language? And I'll give you, yes?
Just a quick question to understand the test and this specific prompt. Who gets this prompt?
This is kind of like in a...
Is it a student who got into, like, let's say, a business program?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because otherwise it's too complicated for anybody.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You would give them a simple
Yes.
prompt. Okay.
This is very related, and I wanted to show you with the picture narration task. It's basically the one end of the continuum. I'll show you now the other end of the continuum. And I'll show you, and again, this is often a discussion between kind of like a more language for specific purposes course. But it would also relate to if you're teaching a more content-based course. And one, for example, situation where people were looking at that is as redesigning the whole Spanish course for the Border Patrol Academy. So they had a very grammar-based course and vocabulary-based course. They kind of like turned it into a more task-based course, and Marta Gonzalez-Loret and Katie Nielsen looked at that. And so they came up, they did a needs analysis, what kind of tasks do these agents need, these officers need to do, be able to do with language when they are patrolling the border and when they are arresting people crossing the border illegally. And so one of the final tasks is a role play task. I think we're kind of like familiar with a lot of role play tasks sometimes. And so they're playing critical scenarios with professional role players. The students, they role play these key course tasks over a couple of days. And it's criterion reference scoring. And each scenario is scored by 2 instructors. So criterion referenced. Does that ring a bell? Yep. So instead of just comparing your students, which is norm-referenced, you kind of like have, okay, it's basically a fail or succeed, a yes or no judgment. Do you meet this criteria or not? And they identified criteria, and I'm just giving this for your information. And so on the one hand, they identified criteria which are again related to language. So they're assessing the language, that they're trying to do both. Looking at the accuracy, although it's more a little bit appropriateness. Are the officer's commands, questions and comments appropriate to the situation? Are they fluent enough? Because you don't want to be arrested by an officer who's really struggling for the words like Mohammed. That would be a very painful process. And is the language clear, comprehensive enough? So they have language criteria, but also very important for them is they have to analyze, basically, is the officer asking all the right questions? Because this is kind of like a strict procedure. So the language is, yes, it's important, but basically, if he's not inquiring about the subject's well-being, looking into the physical condition and determining the need for medical assistance, then this arrest or whatever might go wrong. So this is like one situation, and I just want to have you think a little bit about it, and we'll build on that when we're looking at writing in a minute, on how you try to combine content criteria with language criteria. And I think in a lot of contexts, you're trying to do both. And I had one more task, but I'll have a look at the time. First, I think it's time for a well-needed break. So let's say 10 minutes. Thank you very much. This was a wonderful performance. Yeah, let's. And for the raters as well. Okay, I'm going to show you one, and perhaps I have to apologize up front because the examples that I have are more for advanced learners here. So let's have a look at that, and I want to particularly show you one way of doing this, which I'm pretty impressed with. And that's the next example. This is an example I just want to show you briefly. We talked a little bit just before about, the whole content and language issue. So this is one of the assessments so the certificate Dutch as a foreign language used to have for students that want to go and study in the Netherlands or go and study in Belgium at a college or at the university level. So it's kind of gauging their level of academic language use. So this is the benchmark. This is set at the B2 level of the CFR. And what they're asked to do is it tries to create, we talked a little bit about it, about a context. About, okay, so assigning a certain role, a certain audience, a certain purpose for doing this task. So you're going to be a student, you're studying biology at the University of Ghent, and for the next class of the course cell biology, of course, you have to write a summary of a recent scientific magazine paper or article. So they get an article, in this case in Dutch, which you can't read, but it's about stem cells. It's about how that works. But it is kind of like, it's an accessible article. It's not a scientific article. It's more of an article that you find in a magazine, in a newspaper, talking about what is the current state of affairs in stem cells. So they read the assignment in the syllabus, and then they also, in the syllabus, they are given a number of content criteria that they have to pay attention to. So the summary should inform a group of students that has not read the article, so it has to be self-contained, you have to understand it. And you have to talk about who conducted the research, what the result of the study was, how the result was obtained, discuss 3 positive effects of the study and 2 limitations of the study. And then they have to write a coherent and concise summary in their own words. They can't copy sentences from the text, and they get a certain amount, a frame that they have to use to write. So this is a kind of standardized assessment. And what it tries to do is, on the one hand, find a balance between what I just noticed, the strong form of task fulfillment, looking at content and looking at language. So there are language criteria, but first of all, it's also content criteria. Are the students able to understand this text and reproduce the gist of this text in a written summary, taking into account mentioning these aspects? And these aspects become criteria. So basically they're checking off, is the summary saying who has conducted the research? Does it explain the result of the study, how the results were obtained? Does it mention 3 positive effects? Does it mention 2 limitations? And on top of that, in addition to that, it gets an analysis of, okay, what is the vocabulary use, what is the syntax use? So, and it's a combination of these 2 elements that gives the final score. And then I want to give you a much more elaborate example. And this is about, and it's one of the nicest examples that I know of a whole language program, in this case the German program in Georgetown, in the university. And there is a whole special issue that discusses how they basically revamped their whole program in a more proficiency-based, task-based program. And it has become a kind of content-based program as well. So from the first level, from the first year to the 4th year. And you can find it in the Modern Language Journal, and I can add it to the Google map or the folder that we're giving you access to. But what they did very nicely is they are identifying writing tasks at different levels. And I just want to show you the one. This is the most advanced one at level 4. And this is the summative assessment of level 4. And it's about, and it's a little bit of, there's a little bit of a tricky thing there, which I'm a little bit on the fence about. It's about giving a lecture, but you prepare your lecture in a written form. And so you are, basically the students are challenged to give a lecture at the Society for German-American Relations in Weimar, in Germany. And they are looking for a presentation on, of course, the much discussed topic, the European Union and the founding of the United States, a model. And so they talk about it 50 minutes, but they are writing out their presentation and their argumentation. But what it does very nicely, and that's why I wanted to show you this example, is they try to create a very specific and clear context for their students. Basically trying to make it crystal clear what they need to do. And that's something that we struggle with sometimes in assessment. Either we have a very generic prompt, please tell us about how you use social media, or about how social media is used in the world today, or we kind of like, from a more really contextualized perspective, we try to provide more context. So for example, saying you are speaking to a particular audience, the audience knows everything about the European Union, but the founding fathers of America, that's basically unknown to them. So in your talk, in your written argument, you will have to focus a little bit more on the foundational history of the USA and the development of the country. So keep that in mind, what the occasion is, what the audience is, and what you're going to talk about. And what I like about that is, and I want you to have a look at that, I included the task sheet and the rating in your syllabus. So look at the handout, and it's a long one. So they have what they did, and it took them like a couple of years to do this. So I'm not trying to discourage you, but it took them a lot of time because basically they engaged all the lecturers in this whole process in trying to define which are the genres, which are the tasks that we really want to focus on, and what for us is a good performance. If we are asking our students to do this, what do we expect of them? And again, what they did, and that's why I wanted to give you this example, and I couldn't find an example from a lower level, otherwise I would have, I couldn't find one in the special issue. But it talks a little bit about, it describes the task of the public appeal, what they call the public appeal, and they kind of make it very explicit to the students what they need to do. They have to come up with an engaging title, they have to describe the problem, they have to provide solutions and suggestions, and they have to formulate an appeal to a concrete action. And so they have, again, content criteria. And I wanted to give you this because I feel like they have gone a whole stretch in identifying linguistic criteria as well. They have that for different levels, and in the special issue you can find the different linguistic criteria operationalized for all the levels. You can find it there. It's just not linked to a specific task. This one is linked to the specific task. And it was just for me like a way of, and you can find this very interesting. You can be rather be against this, of doing this in such a specific way, but they really try to nail down all their linguistic expectations for their students as well. And trying to combine them in, look, this is a task we want you to do, be able to do this at the end of the year. This is going to be your summative assessment, your big task. This is your writing assignment, and we're going to analyze that using certain content criteria, and we're going to analyze that using certain linguistic criteria. And we're going to see whether you can meet this criteria. And you will see that I believe that all the criteria, so you also have the kind of the rubric, but the rubric is also a way for them of providing feedback on the task. And they will use this rubric, and they will use the same language focus criteria throughout all the writing tasks that they have in that year, in that semester, and provide feedback on that. And as you can see, they basically give equal weight to all of the categories, to the task category, the content category, and the linguistic language focus category. So I think this is, for me, this is a very interesting way. They went through a whole process of revamping their language program, deciding on which tasks do we want to introduce to our students, which tasks do we want to assess our students on, and then build their curriculum towards these tasks. So what they did is basically really think through what their formative assessment was, what they were doing in their classroom, identifying a number of writing tasks, and what the end of unit achievement assessment is. And again, with every task, trying to think of content criteria and language criteria. And so do you see, Rajiv, this kind of like where you meet, everything meets in the middle a little bit, the concern for certain language focus and how to address that, and provide feedback. Okay, I'll give you just like a minute to look at that and see whether you have any questions about that. And what do you think about it?
How much time are they given to perform the task? Is it a spontaneous or is it prepared?
No, they get this task well in advance. So they know they will be assessed on that task. So that will be their end of unit achievement assessment. I'm not exactly sure when they're giving it. I would expect it that they are being presented with this at the beginning of the unit. So that they have the whole time of the unit to prepare for that.
So it's not a timed test?
No, no.
Are they writing different drafts? They're writing task 1, task 2, task 3?
That's something that they could do. I'm not sure whether they're doing that.
Because in, there are research about writing about the same
Yes.
topic, many drafts would
Yeah.
lead to the better.
Yes, and we'll have a look at that in a minute with the next rubrics. Yes, but it's a good point. So I think, and it's an interesting discussion about the timed task, because like most, of course, if you do an independent assessment, like with TOEFL, IELTS, or whatever, you always get a timed task. But in real life, you almost never get a timed task. You never just sit down and write the whole essay. You kind of like split it up, you determine when you're going to write, and some people basically might say, I'm going just to write this in one iteration, and I'm not going to read through it. And some people just might write it up piecemeal and then revise a paragraph once they have written a paragraph. Some of them might just start revising the whole draft after they have written everything. So that's also very, links up with personality and personal taste. Okay, are there any questions about this? Or any? So now I will provide you with a special issue. So it's very long, so you just don't start reading it from the beginning. But you can use it for perhaps some inspiration on how they described, how they defined their tasks, how they defined their genres that the students needed to be able to do, and what kind of linguistic elements focus that they chose. That might be of some inspiration to you. I know that it is, of course, it's German, it's a big program, but I thought that it was still it's one of the nicest, and there are not that many programs that completely revamped their whole their program, thinking from a kind of like more proficiency-based perspective. And then I'll just linking it up with the speaking. You also have two writing rubrics, and again, the first one, example 1, is a very traditional writing rubric, and the second one, linking up with Rajiv's comment, is more process-oriented. It's about the whole writing. We know that it's a process of a first draft, hopefully good feedback, revising it, and trying to kind of like advance your argument in a more clear way, in better language, in more convincing language, and so on. So I just wanted to give you both. Have a look at them. See which one whether you have a preference. And I just wanted to give you a lot of ideas here, and again, you can start combining both or not. So whatever you want to focus on. And the first one really links up with a lot of the rubrics that are traditionally being used in large-scale assessments like TOEFL and IELTS. They do it a little bit in a different way, but the same categories always come back when you think about writing, or even when you think about speaking. Don't know whether you have any questions. It's a lot to digest, so I'll just give you time. You can look at it later on, and always feel free to contact me about these. So these were kind of drafted by a colleague of mine, Paula Winky. So you can definitely see how example 2, the more process-oriented rubric, might be very informative for formative assessments, for assessment throughout the year, and help your students to become better writers and pay attention to certain steps also in the writing process.
I guess that
Yes?
I mean, the writing rubrics that we are seeing, or the most language-oriented or process-oriented, are not mutually exclusive.
No, no. That's what I think. No, both can be combined. Yes. Yeah.
You know, I love this group rubric. It's amazing. I mean, there could be a couple of more things. Maybe the teacher's feedback should be added there. My recent publication happened on multiple writing process of the same topic. And what I found in the research, like when they're writing multiple drafts of the same thing, content and organization well received and it gets the more feedback from peer and teachers. But when on a linguistic side of it, when I give given a coded feedback, so I call it dynamic corrective feedback, and then they're making, like if I, on a first draft I give some coded feedback, they won't make the mistake there. And the similar mistakes they make on the other places is I guess if there are a couple of things we can include in this is going to be one, like the teacher's feedback and uptake of the feedback could be the one more criteria.
Sure, absolutely,
in kind of classroom setting.
And I think ways of also combining them, because that's not being very operationalized here, is what do you give feedback on? So you could almost say, I'm using this one for the whole process, and I'm using this one as a kind of a feedback instrument. But this might be too vague for the students, for peer feedback, but you might want to operationalize that. And we're going to give you an example of that in a minute, or how you might go about that. Okay, I just wanted to talk just a little bit, and I know it's always, I'm just like touching upon stuff, otherwise this would probably, we could talk about this a whole year in a whole course, and is about effective feedback. So what is effective feedback?
I mean, if there is any uptake of any feedback, then it is effective.
It's effective. A good definition. Very operationalized definition. I'm saying X, do I see X appearing in the student's language use product? Yeah. There has been books written about feedback, and I just wanted to point to how, because we've been talking about assessment, we haven't really differentiated a lot between formative assessment and summative assessment. We know that with formative assessment, feedback is very crucial. You know John Hattie? No? Have you ever heard of John Hattie? He is the guru of meta-analyses. He did number of years ago. He's a professor in New Zealand, and he just like collected all the meta-analyses that he could find in education, and he did a meta-analysis of the meta-analyses. And so one of the most important aspects that impacted students' learning was feedback. So that had an effect size of 0.78, which was almost unseen. So he's been a big proponent of effective feedback. A book has just come out. It even says 2019. It has just come out on effective feedback. And after that, he wrote his meta-analysis. He also wrote a book with a cognitive psychologist about what we know about learning and how learning takes place. And in that book, I found this quote. I find this very interesting. And it's very, in a certain way, it's vague, but it kind of touches upon a lot. And he said students really want feedback. They're crying out for feedback. But it's feedback that they provide them with information on how to achieve their goals, where to next. They need to know how to close the gap between where they are now and where they need to be. And they are uninterested in evaluative post-mortems. And it's always like, so if they give them a text and then you analyze what's wrong with that, and say, look, this language you need, this is a wrong use of the tense or of aspect. It's basically what he calls, this is a post-mortem. You've got a body there. You're dissecting your body and telling what's going on and what's wrong. But nobody gets any better by knowing, well, of course that's not completely true, but by dissecting the body, you need to know how can we move on. And so, and he says, and that's the thing, you have to provide crystal clear guidance about the next challenge and how to best get there, preferably also in the short term. because short-term gains are very motivating for students. And that's of course very vague. And so in this new book, they operationalized it a little bit. Well, more than a little bit, but they're talking not only about language, they're talking also about mathematics, physics, and so on. It's a very general one. So they have like 8 steps toward feedback for learning, which are, but the basic 3 questions that have been out there for a long time. One of his earlier studies with Hattie and Timperley, another professor, and Black and William, these famous researchers that basically looked at formative assessment, they agree on the 3 big questions. Feedback has to go, where am I going? And where am I right now? And how am I going where I'm going? So how to get there? It has to be not only just where am I now, but where do I have to go? And how can you provide me with feedback that helps me to go that way and to go to that particular goal? And one way of operationalizing this in more detail, I'm just going to show you one way, is when we're talking about like writing, and you can think about that in terms of speaking, reading, and listening as well, is defining success criteria. Is defining, okay, what now is a good performance? What do we expect from you as a student when you are doing this task? And so what they try to do is a breakdown of the learning objective. They provide to be a benchmark for the quality of learning. So, okay, where have you been successful? Where can you improve? And so how can we help you improve that? Can we discuss some strategies for that to focus on? Yes?
Sorry, is this criteria or feedback is for content or the form?
Let's just have a look, yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Sorry.
and yes, and this is one example, and again, I think that depends. One of the things that they find what's even better if you are able to co-construct those criteria with your students. So think back about the Georgetown example. It's what you first need to do then is, of course, identify your tasks, your genres, whatever you would call them, that you feel these are really important. I want my students to be able to do this. And then take a step back, think of tasks, and think also about, but what does it mean to be able to do this with a satisfying result? And they discuss some ways of doing that, but important about the co-constructed criteria is that study after study finds that they have a greater chance of understanding and internalizing these criteria, of ownership. This is, I know what to do. I know what you're asking from me and of me. And for example, you could help and you could, again, structure that whole process by looking at, for example, already good example, excellent examples, and analyzing them, linking this back to Julie with the inductive approach to what now is a really good public appeal, what is a good letter, what is a good whatever.
I have a question.
Yes?
I heard that there's this sort of a general trend now that just embrace like what you are good at and not to stress what people are bad at, but just focus on the strengths.
Yeah.
Could this sort of apply in some way to the model which you were sort of mentioning? But because then really something's behind, but it will boost the confidence, motivation,
yes,
and all these other positive effects.
Okay, just give me 1 or 2 seconds. Let's first address this. Let's look at these criteria. So I copied some of Hattie and Clark, but this is about creative writing. Okay, just like take a minute for yourself. What would constitute success criteria for good creative writing?
In a foreign language context?
In a foreign language, in your context. And just, that's how much time do we have? Like just like 1 minute for yourself and just 1 minute to talk to your neighbor about that. What would you identify as good creative writing? And I'm going to put these up. These are from a different context then. But then we can talk also about your question about how do you deal with that? Identifying the strengths and also weaknesses. What do you do about it? And if you're not doing any creative writing, you can think of another task for yourself. Yes. I put it there because sometimes it gives bleeps. I don't know how to silence them yet. It's on the phone. I didn't want to bleep. Okay. Cool.
Challenges for our students. There are not kids anymore.
Of course, the heritage.
Okay. Anybody wants to share what they talked about? What kind of success criteria were you thinking of? Was it easy to think of some criteria that you would kind of present to your students? Would you like to share? Would you like to share?
I was thinking, I teach the more basic levels, the more elementary levels. I was thinking about if they can create, usually they just write kind of sentences, and I would like them to be able to form something that's more coherent, works that's more creative, even in the basic.
Okay, yeah. So going past that, yeah. Anybody else wants to share?
We're talking a lot about organization, that's important to make it understandable.
Yes, the structure of the text, thoughts, how it's organized.
Organized thoughts.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just briefly share you with these ones, what the author comes up with. So when you're talking about, again, creative writing, what effects do you want your writing to have on the reader? It's what will do this best. So how, in this case, if you're doing a kind of a narration story, how would you best create that effect? And then it goes more into detail. For example, have you avoided obvious cliched descriptions? For example, how are you using adjectives? How can adjectives add to that effect and kind of like compel the reader to keep reading? Have you chosen interesting informative nouns and verbs and give examples of that? And so on. They have a couple of more. And how do you also want the reader to feel when they read your ending? Choose the best way of doing so. And I'm not married to these criteria. They don't really matter a lot. I just wanted to show you some examples because I think you can combine content there, or in general, what kind of effect? What do you want your writing to be about? Does it addresses the audience? Does it kind of like realizes its purpose? If you want to write a complaint letter to AT&T, basically, do you get the job done? So the task fulfillment, it needs to be in there. It needs to be, are you being aware, it might be being aware of your audience, who are you addressing, how do you go about that? But it also tries, I always find always interesting, and this is of course for creative writing, trying to also integrate a language focus there, but very purposeful. Not just are you using nouns and adverbs, but why would you be using them? Why would you now, in this sense, create, why would you focus on this paragraph length? So why do you want them with this kind of task, with this kind of genre? Why would that basically create a more successful writing a product, a performance, than if you just kind of say one sentence after another, or just all connect them with then and then and then and then. And by the way, this is something very normal. This is a whole process. Writing is a very difficult skill. And we know from a lot of research, even going back to the 80s, Scardamelia and the writer, which are kind of like the gurus of writing, they did a very exhaustive analysis of writing. And they said, like, everyone, if it's a foreign language learner, or just like your native language speaker and writer, go to a process where first writing is all about what they call knowledge telling. It's basically just putting ideas out there. It's not connected even yet. It's how children start writing. They start writing in sentences, and then they start using connectors, and then. That's knowledge telling. And the big thing is, they say, as a good writer, you become a knowledge transformer. You take one step back, and you're able to restructure all these ideas. And what's interesting is that they point out that even a lot of native speakers never become knowledge transformers. So you might even be a native speaker, but writing at that particular level is a hard job. It's very difficult to do. It's not everybody is able to do that, and it's good to be aware of that. Okay, so but it's like, if you identify these success criteria, you can already say, look, wow, I love your story here, and I love your use of adjectives. You've done a really good job. But perhaps, and then I think coming back to your point, in my opinion, and I know there's a lot of discussion that, and I might be my European side here, I would definitely still kind of like say where they could improve, and that's where they're not that strong. And I know some people, and I don't think, it depends a little bit on who your audience is, on your students, but I don't think it's demotivating. I think it's motivating if you at least can show them, or can even agree with them, okay, I think this piece of writing is wonderful, and what you did with your adjectives. Now for the next piece of writing, I want you to see whether you're able to do that again. I would love to see some improvement on those nouns and those verbs. And agree with them. And I think, again, agreeing on this kind of individualized feedback, but also a kind of like targets, identifying this is your target for you the next time. And perhaps you're good, but I think the organization could be better. Think about how you open your story, and think about how you finish it, and then, so let's work on that. So I think that's really effective feedback. It might be a little bit more individualized, kind of like agreeing on, I think this is a point for you to work on. On the next couple of writings, think about how you're putting these linguistic elements, these nouns and these verbs, or perhaps these adjectives, or you're using a lot of cliches. Let's try to move away from that. And link that to the specific tasks and genres. It basically will be kind of like the link to the types of genres that you're writing about, and it might be genre specific there. Yes?
I have some questions. I'm trying to picture it. So would you recommend, first of all, doing that in person, and like not just to write your comments, you know, or remarks, and then is it something you do maybe in front of the class? Would you share, of course, with their consent?
Yeah.
Someone's writing and like talk about what you can do better with that, or is that like something that can take away from someone, or like what about like sharing? Maybe it's kind of the peer review you were talking about here, peer feedback. So I was thinking about the context of giving the.
Yeah, those are really good questions. So this takes us deep more into the writing pedagogy. So I think there is no really one-size-fits-all answer here. I think what we know, so I think on the one hand, providing written feedback but that it's really clear, that they can address, and sometimes even people would say just don't correct them, but indicate what kind of category of error this is, and let them figure it out for themselves, is something that might be very effective. I think you might, depending on how familiar your students are with the set of criteria that you have identified, you might just put it on writing. I think, great job with the adjectives. I want you to pay attention in your next writing, I want you to pay attention to this criteria. And you then might, I think it helps if you find the time to just like have it, really just like 1 minute conversation with the student about that, or that they feel so confident that they come to you and ask you more in more specific details about how can I do that, because I think that's a nice, we know we have discussed this subject, success criteria, and I know this is something that I can improve on, but I have no idea how. Can you provide me with some help there? It has proven to be very successful to discuss even some examples in front of the class, to put them on the screen, have students look at them, have them even give suggestions for own suggestions for improvement, and discuss those. You can't do that all of the time. If you show existing examples of students, then you have to get their consent and that they feel comfortable with that. Even if you think it's anonymous, they might still figure it out, or you might use examples from last year to start out from. So I think that's also very helpful sometimes to give, not only to give good models of this is what a good model looks like. Okay, we have now, for example, 2 attempts of students trying to kind of like do the same thing, create a good model, but we see that they go somewhere, they lose themselves in their own thoughts, in their own narration. So how can we identify those? How could we avoid these pitfalls for ourselves? And how can we improve that? It has proven to be a very effective means also of doing it in class. I would hesitate of addressing individual feedback there. What I would do, if you have like all these great, if you feel that like at least 50% or 2/3 of your class is struggling with this, I would address that as well in class. And say, look, there is some individual feedback here, you find that on your writing, but I think when I looked at all these tasks, I felt like we as a class are struggling with this and that. So how can we tackle that? How can we improve that? And then again, also make that a point of peer feedback for them next time. You will be looking at that point. Yes.
If I can just comment on one of those.
Yes.
Points. I teach a freshman writing class in English.
Yes.
So it's not a language-based thing, but it's, writing pedagogy again. And I do everything that you actually say, but one of the things that I do is I call this best practices this year. And 1 week we focus on how to write an introduction, right?
Yeah.
I don't show them how to do it, but I select, I have 15 students, right? So I select 3 examples out of 15, either from that year or from the year before, right? And I just put 3 examples of a short introduction on a piece of paper, not even on the board. I actually give it to them in case they want to write on it. And I tell them this is not arranged in any particular order. I want you to read all 3 of them and rate them. The best one, give it a plus. The average one, give it a check mark. The bad one, give it a minus. And then explain to me why you did it that way and what this writer can do to actually improve it, right? And I've seen that actually work really, really well.
I like it, and I like it for several reasons, but one thing is what like...
And that's also peer review,
Yes. What everybody is really good at, and we have a lot of research now going on is, so if you have essays or whatever, every written product, every spoken product, each of us and everyone, being a language teacher, a non-language teacher, basically has a strong gut feeling, if you compare 2 examples, which one is the better. There is a really high consensus. If you just ask people, rate this, which is the better product? Almost everybody will agree on that. It's very difficult to operationalize and to make explicit why we think this is a better product. And this is of course part of being a language teacher, then sometimes trying to bring that to the surface, because it's deep, it's buried deep down. We know, oh, we like this one. If we look at 2 letters of when you are launching a complaint to AT&T, I know that this is the better letter. But why is that the case? That's very difficult. And engaging in that discussion with your students, giving them an opportunity to think about those criteria, make them explicit and make them the subject of a conversation in the classroom, and agreeing on these criteria is something very strong.
I think a rubric really contributes to that, having a clear rubric, because that's how I grade their papers.
Yes.
But that's what they learn to use when they speak about the examples that they see too.
And but then the thing is, you have to get a rubric that really they can internalize, that they can relate to.
So exactly to that point, I don't do peer editing or peer review anymore in my classes because it's clunky and I feel it's time consuming. So instead I switched to self-review and self-editing. And so I require, especially at the lower levels, I require them to write like a zero draft and then go through an editing process, whether it's filling out a form and responding or showing me that they've made some changes. Not only at the lower levels, we're mostly looking at vocabulary, grammar, spelling, but now in the third year level, we're looking also at organization and things like that. And so that's another strategy. To then, like, once you develop those best practices and you can show them, then it's one thing to look at someone else's work and say, why is this bad, why is this good, but then to really require them to look back at their own work.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think absolutely, yeah. Okay, I see the time ticking away and I don't want to deprive you of any lunchtime. So basically to sum up this, these two sections, basically, I'm going back to John Norris. Thinking about performance assessment, he says, just think about a number of categories. Consider real-world criteria. And he says, on the one hand, think about performance products. Does something happen? Does something get produced? The whole task fulfillment idea. But also, sometimes you need to think about the process. The process is very handy. Do critical elements of the task happen? So it's breaking it down. Do you see that certain performance steps are being... so for example, the complaint letter, do you think it gets the job done? Will AT&T respond to my letter? But perhaps if we break down the complaint letter, can we see like, okay, I have explained in very clear language what the problem is. And perhaps I want to give a suggestion on how I want to be helped by AT&T or something like that. That's also kind of like the performance steps. And then identify, and we talked about that, it's not all about the task fulfillment. You might want to break down in more linguistic or other criteria as well. And then you also have still have this expectation. Have this expectation, not only does it get the task done, how well does it get the task done? Do I feel that this is one letter that I would give like 5 stars and put out there as the best example ever of a letter of complaints? Okay, I still had one section, so I'm just going to briefly talk about that, and you have it in your handout. I'm not sure how many people are acquainted with IPA, and it's not a beer. Unfortunate, but yeah, whoever came up with this? Integrated performance assessment. And it's again something being used a lot in K-12. It's promoted by Actful. There's a book on that. You can buy it. Unfortunately, you can't download it. And what it, again, I wanted to just briefly talk about it because I think it kind of integrates a lot of what we've been talking about. But it is identifying for a particular unit, for a particular project, for a particular theme. From the perspective of this reverse design, you have stated your goals. Then you think about your assessment. How are you going to identify the tasks that your students now need to do and that they will be assessed on? And in terms of Actful, this is always an interpretive, an interpersonal, and a presentational task. And these are aligned within the single theme or content, and so they reflect the manner in which students would acquire and use that language. And then they have, and that's why I wanted to point it out, they have these scoring rubrics. And Julie already showed you that as well. And it's, they have criteria, and then it's always like it exceeds expectation, it meets the expectation, or it doesn't meet the expectation. And with meeting the expectation, you have a strong and a minimal one. So I just put it in the PowerPoint. You can have a look at the PowerPoint. This is the interpersonal task rubric. So if you buy the book, you have access to all the rubrics. And again, it's about, in this case, interpersonal. And what I like is it's not only how well am I understood, but also how well do I understand my conversation partner, my interlocutor. And then it's about also language and some other criteria there. I just have like 2 examples. This is more from high school, and then I point you to an example that we developed for Swahili. So this is an example for high school. It's focused at intermediate mid-level. And it's kind of, again, creates this context and creates certain expectations. You are an exchange student at a senior high school in Japan. It's an exciting time of the year because your school is starting to plan its school festival. And you're a little familiar with what goes on in school festivals from watching anime and reading manga, but you've never experienced one for yourself. So you're looking forward to getting involved and want to be able to plan the activities alongside your new classmates. So it gives a little bit of a context, and then identifies certain tasks. In order to help you prepare for the upcoming festival, you're giving a flyer to study, which is interpretative. After you've spent time reading the flyer, you decide to talk with a classmate and ask him or her questions about the event. So this is the interpersonal one. And then you have the presentation one. After that, you're going to present on that work. So it's kind of like it tries to integrate these tasks. This is what you're working on in this theme, in this unit, and then you have this assessment, step by step. Another one is creating an ideal camp. So students read a brochure advertising a year-round camp for students. They might also listen to the weather forecast from that particular region, whether it's a good, which camp might be interesting to go to in the summer, if you like a lot of rain or not. Then they have a conversation about the camp, what they like, what they don't like. They also discuss the weather in this case. And then you design a presentation and a campaign, an ad campaign for, I want to go to this camp and I want to convince everybody to join me going to that camp. So this is kind of the structure of how these IPAs are being conceptualized. So in your syllabus, you find a kind of like, it's not following exactly the IPA, but it's, so within the Lickle partnership, so we created Swahili module. And this is kind of like, we were kind of like seeing how would we go about assessing this. And so you have then this scenario. I don't think we have the time to discuss it, but you can have a look at it. And it's not just like 3 tasks. In this case, there are 4 tasks. And we identified these tasks because they are kind of like embedded in what the students are going through in this module. And so it is a role play. It is a presentation. It is, again, a more presentation, and then it is writing a Facebook post. So it's just one idea about how we contextualized these assessments for this module, and how we identified in this module some tasks. This is a task, so this is a Swahili module on study abroad, and having students do some work on that. And it's basically taking the students to the study abroad program, to Kenya, and think about what they need to do. And finally, you find the, I think this is the full, or part of it at least, part of it, the presentational mode rubric for intermediate high learners you find also in the handout. And I think I still have 7 minutes left for any questions that you have. So I think it's perhaps if you, I don't know whether you have questions, otherwise also provided, in the syllabus, just this is something that we did at another workshop, is you could start thinking about reverse design very easily by just like trying to write out your language goals in these columns, the assessment, and the activities that come along with it. Any questions? Yes.
This integrated assessment, it seems like it has so many parts. Like, do you watch them have their conversation and then they do the writing part and you take that home and read it, and like?
I think, yeah, so there are different ways of doing it. I think most of them in like the K-12 setting is, you know, now we're doing it. And so they have this as consecutive steps in a sequence. So they do the performance and then everything is rated. Or like the written product will be rated afterwards. Yeah. So with the Swahili one, what we felt like you could do this on different, throughout the course.
Yeah.
But we identified basically, this is the task that we're going to assess you on. So you know in advance, while you go through this unit, this is a task that is crucial for your assessment. So I think, again, as an instructor, for me, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Try to pick some of the ideas that speak to you and how can you integrate them in your class so that you feel comfortable with them and that you create a context where your students feel comfortable with them.
So, thank you so much. This was very informative for me. What my takeaway is, and I want you to tell me like if I'm taking away right thing or wrong thing, you know. My takeaway is like the whole system of the criteria and assessment, some part of it looks more focused on the content and task and fulfillment of the task. Some part of it looks more on the vocabulary and syntax and grammar. Language specifically, I see that when German was talking about the whole Georgetown things happen, like they focused more on syntax part of it. I'm taking away from the system that it depends on the morphologically rich or syntactically complex language versus syntactically less or no complex language. For example, Russian could be morphologically very complex, and Sanskrit or Hindi, so is Arabic, but maybe English is not that complex morphologically. So a teacher like us, or assessment guru like yourself, can create a new blended kind of a rubric. And is that kind of a goal that we are going to achieve, or like is that at least, I don't know what to say.
I'm not saying, well, what I think is you're absolutely right, Rajiv. I think it's a little bit more complex. I think it's not just it depends on the language. I think it depends a lot on who are you as a teacher. What are your beliefs as a teacher, how language is being learned. I think you're the crucial. Your personal beliefs, your personal pedagogical and teacher beliefs are what are very important. And how they connect with the language. And then there's a third element in the comparison, and that's your students. Also, what do they expect? How do they see language learning? So one of the interesting things is the first 3 years ago when I came here, I was part of a focus group. And because we had this language proficiency flagship project, and we were talking to students. And what was really interesting to me is like these students, they came from high school, and these were students of Spanish and French and German basically, or Spanish, in this case Spanish, and they learned Spanish in a certain way in high school, and that was a very PPP approach. It was based on grammar and it was based on vocabulary. And they entered a language program which was being shaped by Bill Van Patten, who is completely against that kind of instruction. He said it's input processing instruction. And what we heard from these students was that they felt completely lost. They felt, we are not learning anything here. We are de-learning our language. And which wasn't true, but like the instructor said, well, how I tried to make that clear to the students is I had an interview with them at the beginning of the year, and we had a conversation. And then we have regular conversations. And then I point out to them, you thought that you knew Spanish, or you knew Spanish, but you didn't know how to put it into practice. We're now basically learning you how to speak, how to use the language. You might feel that you're not learning the language because you have operationalized learning a language as learning the grammar and learning vocabulary and knowing this and adding to that knowledge base. But adding to that knowledge base is one aspect of what I have called competency, but you have to be able to use that. If you can't put it into action, or if you can only put it into action when you're reading a text, in your situation where you say, well, I only need to decipher these texts, or I need to only do some reading and listening, and it still might help me, although I feel that there is also another component to reading and listening than just knowing the grammar and the vocabulary. So I think the whole three variables and the interplay of these variables is very important. It's not just the language. There's definitely a language element there. But yeah. Yes. Yes.
I'm just curious about reading assessment. I know that you mentioned IPA, integrative kind of assessment, and then also it was a little bit part of the writing assessment. But what is your take on the reading assessment itself? I don't know if you
Again, there are many ways of assessing reading, and again, it links up with your view of what reading is. So traditionally, reading is if you go to any standardized test, reading is assessed using multiple choice questions, and basically that is the case because it's the only practical way that we know of doing it, and it's the only practical way of, which is very important for standardized assessment, to get enough data points to create a reliable assessment of reading. If you're in the classroom, multiple choice questions, they're tricky. Tricky to create reliable assessments. And then the question is also, what do they look like? And there are all these theories of reading, but the most important ones would be that you have multiple choice questions that you formulate at different levels. So you might have multiple choice questions that focus on language. And basically what mean on language means then on the understanding of certain vocabulary items in the text. The second level would be going beyond, the second level would be not just assessing the language, but also, do my students understand the literal meaning of this text? What is being explicitly said in this text? Can I, for example, ask them this sentence or this couple of sentences, what's actually the meaning of it? What's the point? What's the literal meaning of this? A next level would be a more interpretative level, is more what reading between the lines. Is, can my students not only access the literal meaning of what's being said in this text, but can they reason beyond that? Can they see what the point is a particular author is trying to make here, or what is being implied here? Because you can't say everything in a text, but sometimes you imply things. Can they understand the meaning of what's being implied? Can they make inferences about the text? So there are all these kind of levels that you should then gauge to get a good idea of their reading. So multiple choice, it's the most, people use that because it's easy, they think it's easy. It's one of the most difficult things to do, to create good, reliable and valid multiple choice questions. And it goes back to what kind of theory of reading you have in your mind and out there. Other ways of doing that, and these are more task-based, is again thinking about what is my reading purpose here. But it's less time efficient, because how I would do that, if I want to see if students can access multiple texts and combine information from that text. I would give you here, these are 3 texts on the language, on the European Language Union and the American founders. Just like read them, get the information out of them. You've got half an hour. Or just like, okay, you want to see whether you can go to the X-Men movie this weekend. Okay, just go to that website, click on and see whether you can get the information. So this is a single task, finding on the one hand and thinking more about strategic use of reading. Why are you reading this text? Are you reading this text? Nobody is reading every text to understand every detail of a text. So I always give when I was still reading a newspaper, I always felt like if I was reading a newspaper on a Saturday morning, reading a newspaper activates all the reading strategies that you need. You never are going to read the whole newspaper. You don't have the time for that. You start looking at some of the titles, which of the topics are of interest to you. Then you start reading, you might start scanning that newspaper article and say, oh, okay, good. I know now what May's position is on the Brexit. And they say, oh, this is interesting. I don't know what they mean with this backstop in the whole Ireland issue and Northern Ireland issue. I need to know that. I'm going back to the beginning of that article and going to read through the whole article because I really want to know everything in detail about that. So for me, that activates, reading a newspaper like that activates all the reading purposes that you can think of. And if you start thinking about that, then you start thinking about tasks. How can I create a task that basically gauges that purpose? And that might be just finding out one specific element in a text. So knowing when and where I have to go to for engaging in that particular activity. It might be getting the gist of the text. So I just might read the text and scan it, skim it, to get a particular idea of what this text is about. I might want to read this text in a lot of detail because I really need to formulate an argument pro or against something. So I really need to read the text in detail. And in a classroom, I would use all of these tasks and these strategies to activate and help your students kind of do that kind of reading. Also, especially also in a foreign language. Because in a foreign language, you will start activating also a little bit of other strategies. You will have the language barrier there. Because like, if you're reading English or you're reading in your native language, skimming and scanning is very easy. It's a little bit more difficult. But again, you also have to decide on if I'm reading this or if I'm reading this novel. And again, if I'm reading, and I gave this example, Salamatu, you'll recognize this. When I started reading, we needed to read French, and the French novel, Le Pont sur la Rivière Kwai, so the bridge over the River Kwai. You start reading that, and you're at a loss. And you then, at some point, you have to adapt your reading strategy, because you start reading and you start looking up words. And you can't keep that up. And at some point, you just have to decide, okay, I'm in the jungle now. This whole passage and paragraph is about me being in the jungle. And I can read through it. And perhaps, oh, but there's something happening here. Perhaps I need to look up this word now, because this word I have come across like 10 times, and I thought that I assigned a meaning to it, but I don't think this is right. So I will now go back to my dictionary or to my Google Translate, and I will look it up. So all these strategies, I think also for foreign language learners, are very important, but they're sometimes not addressed explicitly. And combining thinking of tasks that basically asks them to do that. Sometimes it's just like, okay, you've got 10 minutes, 4 texts. Do this now. It's a lot of work. I must acknowledge that it's a lot of work, as if you have to start constructing your whole syllabus from zero. But that's something you can add over the course of the years. But I think of thinking of reading tasks, and even for language assessment, nobody does that because it's impractical. Giving 4 texts in a TOEFL context and saying now you've got 10 minutes to do that. Nobody knows how to structure that in a practical way. But that would be a really good way to kind of see what you can do, what you can read, and how good your reading skills are in any particular language. So but what we know, and what we always do is when we assess listening and reading, is going back to what we know is our multiple choice questions. Yeah. Okay, I think, yep, Luca is, and I'm just like had this final one, or even not anymore. Oh, it's got stuck. Well, if it got stuck, it got stuck.